Every famous ruin has a secret political story buried in its walls. By the end of this video, you will see ancient stones not as relics of a peaceful past, but as layered archives of conquest, revolt, and sudden collapse. How did a single building capture the rise and fall of an empire within its own mortar? And what does a sudden shift in construction style reveal about a civilization's darkest turning point? These 30 sites hold the answers in their very foundations. When you look at a ruin, do you ever wonder what political upheavals its walls actually witnessed? The massive stone walls of Great Zimbabwe rise from the southern African landscape, a puzzle built without mortar yet standing for centuries. The first phase of this city took shape on a rocky hilltop where Shona kings constructed an elite complex of granite blocks, carefully stacked to create royal residences and ceremonial spaces. This hill complex housed the rulers who controlled trade routes connecting the gold fields of the interior to the Swahili coast. For generations, the settlement grew in influence and wealth, its architecture reflecting stability and power. Then came the second phase, marked by the construction of the Great Enclosure, a sprawling oval structure with walls reaching over 30 feet high. This addition was not just an expansion, but a statement of continued prosperity. Yet soon after, a noticeable change occurred. Builders began thickening the outer walls, adding narrow entrances and blind passages that made the complex harder to approach. The open, welcoming design of earlier centuries gave way to something more guarded. Historians link this shift directly to the arrival of Portuguese explorers and traders along the eastern coast of Africa during the 16th century. These newcomers disrupted established trade networks, introduced new rivalries, and posed a direct challenge to the authority of the Shona kings. The threat was not immediate invasion, but the slow erosion of economic control and political influence. In response, the rulers of Great Zimbabwe turned inward, fortifying their capital against a changing world. The stone walls that once symbolized openness and unity became barriers. Defensive features appeared where none had existed before. This transformation reveals how external political pressure can reshape even the most enduring architecture. The ruins we see today are not just the remains of a lost kingdom, but a physical record of a society fighting to preserve its way of life. What other ancient cities felt the same weight of encroaching powers and altered their very shape in response? High in the Peruvian Andes, a city of polished stone perches between two peaks, its purpose shifting with the politics of empire. Machu Picchu was built in the mid-1500s as a royal estate for the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, a retreat where he could survey his vast domain. The construction followed a precise plan, terraces carved into the mountainside, temples aligned with celestial events, and residential quarters arranged around a central plaza. Every stone was cut to fit without mortar, a signature of Inca engineering at its peak. Yet remarkably, the site shows no signs of later expansion or renovation. No additional buildings were added, no walls thickened, no new plazas laid out. This stillness stands out because most Inca royal estates grew over generations, their rulers adding layers of personal expression. Machu Picchu remained frozen in its original form, as if time itself stopped shortly after its completion. The reason lies in the arrival of Spanish conquistadors in the 1530s. Within a few decades, the Inca Empire was thrown into chaos. Emperors were captured, alliances fractured, and the old order collapsed under the weight of foreign disease and warfare. Machu Picchu, already a remote sanctuary, was abandoned not by force but by necessity. The imperial system that supported it vanished. there were no more rulers to maintain the estate, no more laborers to keep the terraces green, no more priests to conduct ceremonies. The site simply fell silent, its stones standing witness to an empire that could not survive the shock of contact. This abrupt halt in building tells a story of political upheaval more powerfully than any chronicle. The absence of expansion is not a sign of completion but of interruption, a window into a world that never got the chance to continue. What other treasures might have been created if that world had endured? Half a world away from the Andes, an even more ambitious city underwent a transformation that rewrote its own purpose. In the early 12th century, the Khmer king Suryavarman II commissioned a temple of staggering scale in what is now Cambodia. Angkor Wat was designed as a Hindu sanctuary, a physical representation of Mount Meru, the mythical home of the gods. Its 5 central towers rose like lotus buds against the sky, and every wall was covered in elaborate carvings depicting scenes from the Hindu epics. The complex was oriented to the west, an unusual choice that scholars believe was tied to the king's own religious devotion and his desire to associate himself with the god Vishnu. For decades, the temple functioned as the spiritual heart of a Hindu empire. Priests conducted rituals in the central sanctuary, and the surrounding city thrived under a system that blended divine kingship with Brahmanical tradition. Then came a quiet but decisive shift. After Suryavarman's death, the Khmer Empire entered a period of change under Jayavarman VII, a ruler who embraced Mahayana Buddhism and later oversaw the gradual rise of Theravada Buddhism across the region. This was not merely a personal preference but a political reordering of Khmer society. The new king built a different capital at Angkor Thom, and the old Hindu temple of Angkor Wat began to be adapted. Over the following centuries, the central sanctuary was transformed, Buddhist images were installed, and many of the original Hindu carvings were modified or covered. The orientation of rituals changed. What had once been a monument to a single god became a living shrine for a different faith. This conversion was not sudden or violent. It happened slowly, as new rulers and new religious movements brought their own meanings to the old stones. The walls that once told stories of Hindu mythology now hosted monks in saffron robes. Political upheaval was subtle, but its mark on the architecture is undeniable. Angkor Wat stands as a record of how an empire can quietly shift its spiritual foundation, and how a single building can be claimed by new beliefs without losing its original grandeur. What other temples around the world have been silently repurposed by the tides of political change? The delicate stucco walls of the Alhambra shimmer with the whispers of a lost dynasty. High on a hill in Granada, the Nasrid sultans of the 13th and 14th centuries crafted a palace complex that felt more like a dream than a fortress. Water trickled through narrow channels, reflecting the intricate arabesques carved into every surface. Calligraphy flowed across the plaster, verses from the Quran and poetry of the court woven into the architecture itself. The Court of the Lions, with its 12 stone lions supporting a central fountain, was a marvel of engineering and artistry, symbolizing the paradise promised in Islamic tradition. Every arch was a lacework of geometry, every wall a canvas for light and shadow. This was not just a royal residence but a statement of cultural sophistication, a final flowering of Al-Andalus as the Christian kingdoms of the north pressed ever southward. Then came the year 1492, when the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella accepted the surrender of Granada. They entered the Alhambra not as conquerors but as new residents. The transition was initially careful. The delicate Nasrid architecture was preserved, even admired, yet almost immediately a different kind of building began. Within the complex, the Grand Mosque was converted into a church. Its orientation shifted, Christian symbols replacing the mihrab that had once pointed toward Mecca. And then, in the early 16th century, construction started on something far more jarring: the Palace of Charles V. This massive Renaissance structure, with its circular courtyard and classical columns, was planted directly on top of the old Nasrid fabric. It did not replace the existing palace but was built alongside it, a stark geometric statement of the new political order. The contrast could not be more visible. Where the Nasrid architects had used light, intricate plaster, water, and organic forms, the Palace of Charles V was heavy, ordered, and imperial in scale. It was designed to assert a new authority, not to harmonize with what already stood there. The message was clear: the Emirate of Granada was now the seat of a Spanish monarchy that saw itself as the heir to Rome and the defender of Christendom. This architectural overlay tells a story more honestly than any document. The Alhambra is not a single monument but a palimpsest, a page written over by successive rulers. The delicate Nasrid stucco remains, but now it shares space with Renaissance grandeur. The transformation was not gradual but abrupt, a physical reflection of a political upheaval that changed the course of Spanish history. Walking through the Alhambra today, you step from a world of geometric harmony into one of ordered power, each era leaving its mark in stone and plaster. What happens when a palace becomes a symbol not of its builders but of those who followed? The dome of Hagia Sophia floats above Istanbul, a miracle of engineering that has defined an empire for nearly 15 centuries. When Emperor Justinian ordered its construction in 537, he was not merely building a church. He was making a statement that the Eastern Roman Empire, battered by decades of internal strife and external threats, would rise again with unprecedented power and glory. The architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidorus of Miletus pushed the limits of what was possible. They created a central dome that seemed to hang from heaven, its 40 windows flooding the interior with light, a physical representation of divine wisdom. The building was a triumph of Byzantine ambition, a cathedral that dwarfed everything in the ancient world. Then came the 15th century. The empire that had built Hagia Sophia had shrunk to little more than Constantinople itself, surrounded by the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. In 1453, after a long siege, the city fell to the forces of Sultan Mehmed II. The conqueror rode directly to Hagia Sophia, and what he did next would change the building forever. Instead of destroying the great cathedral, he ordered its conversion into a mosque. Within days, the Christian altar was removed, the mosaics depicting saints and emperors were covered with plaster, and a wooden minbar, a preacher's pulpit, was installed. Almost immediately, the first minarets rose from the corners of the structure, tall stone needles that gave the building a new profile against the sky. The interior was reoriented toward Mecca, and the call to prayer replaced the liturgy. This was not a gradual change but a swift assertion of a new political order. The Ottoman Sultan was telling the world that a new empire had arrived, and that the old Christian world would now serve Islam. Yet Hagia Sophia continued to change. In the centuries that followed, later sultans added more minarets, built the mausoleums and school structures that surround the main building, and commissioned massive calligraphic medallions that hang high in the nave. The building absorbed these additions, its original design adapting to new functions. Then came the 20th century and another transformation. In 1934, the Turkish Republic under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk decreed that Hagia Sophia would become a museum. The plaster was removed from some of the Byzantine mosaics, revealing the majestic figures of Christ and the Virgin Mary that had been hidden for nearly 5 centuries. For the first time in history, the building housed both Islamic and Christian art side by side, a symbol of a secular state that sought to bridge its diverse heritage. This was a political upheaval of a different kind, a shift from religious empire to modern nation. Each phase of Hagia Sophia's life was written directly into its structure. The dome remains, but the space around it has been reshaped by conquest, faith, and ideology. Standing under that vast ceiling today, you are not just looking at a building. You are standing inside the layered history of an entire region, where every arch, every inscription, every minaret tells the story of a sudden and decisive change. What other ancient spaces have been forced to carry the weight of so many competing visions of the world? The Colosseum stands at the center of Rome, a monument to empire and its fractures. When the Flavian emperors completed this amphitheater in 80 CE, they intended it as a gift to the Roman people, a stage for grand spectacles that would distract from political tensions and secure their dynasty. Tens of thousands of citizens filled its tiers to watch hunts, mock naval battles, and dramatic performances that celebrated the power and reach of Rome. The building itself was a feat of concrete and stone, its system of vaults and corridors allowing crowds to move in and out with astonishing efficiency. For centuries, it served its original purpose, a symbol of imperial unity and control. Then the empire began to crumble. By the early Middle Ages, Rome was no longer the center of a world power, but a fractured city struggling under the weight of invasions, political chaos, and declining population. The Colosseum, once a stage for imperial spectacle, stood abandoned and neglected. Its marble seating was stripped, its bronze clamps pried loose, and the great arena floor fell into ruin. But the building found a second life. During the 12th and 13th centuries, a powerful Roman family, the Frangipane, took control of the Colosseum and transformed it into a fortified stronghold. They built walls across the arcades, blocked entrances, and raised defensive towers within the ancient shell. The same corridors that once channeled spectators now sheltered soldiers and stored weapons. The arena floor, where thousands had once watched performances, became a courtyard for a private army. This transformation tells a startling story of political fragmentation. Rome had splintered into warring noble factions, each carving out a piece of the ancient city as their own stronghold. The Colosseum, a symbol of a unified empire, became a fortress for a single family, a physical sign that the old order had shattered into countless pieces. By the Renaissance, the building underwent yet another transformation, this time as a stone quarry. Architects and builders looking for materials for the great palaces and churches of the new Rome, including Peter's Basilica, stripped the Colosseum of its travertine blocks. The stones that had once formed the seating for 100,000 Romans were hauled away to build the homes of popes and cardinals. This was not destruction born of hatred but of convenience. The ancient world was a source of raw materials for the new. Each block removed from the Colosseum carried with it a piece of imperial Rome, repurposed into the foundations of a very different political order. The building shrank over the centuries, its southern side completely collapsed until it resembled a ruined skeleton of its former self. Looking at the Colosseum today, you see all these phases at once. The surviving arcades speak of spectacle, the blocked corridors and tower bases hint at fortification, and the missing stones tell of quarrying for a new world. The building is a physical record of how an empire can dissolve into fragmentation, and how the stones of one era can become the foundations of another. What other monuments have been silently dismantled to build the cities that replaced them? High on the Acropolis of Athens, a temple that once honored a virgin goddess has been reborn under 3 different faiths. The Parthenon was built in the 5th century before the Common Era, a masterpiece of classical Greek architecture commissioned by the statesman Pericles. Its marble columns and sculpted friezes celebrated the city-state of Athens and its patron deity, Athena Parthenos, the maiden goddess of wisdom and war. The building stood as a symbol of Athenian democracy and imperial ambition, a treasury for the city's tribute and a stage for grand religious processions. For nearly 1,000 years, it served its original purpose, a gleaming white temple on the rocky hill that overlooked the Aegean Sea. then the political world shifted. The Roman Empire, which had long dominated the Mediterranean, fragmented, and the eastern half, centered on Constantinople, retained control over Greece. Under Byzantine rule, the Parthenon underwent its first major transformation. In the 6th century, it was converted into a Christian church dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The eastern entrance was widened to create an apse, the interior was reoriented toward the east, and the great statue of Athena was removed or destroyed. Bells replaced the sounds of pagan ritual, and Christian murals covered the ancient marble. The building that had celebrated a goddess of the Greek world now honored the Mother of Christ, a change driven not by local preference but by the political and religious authority of the Byzantine Empire. This first conversion was a quiet conquest, an adaptation of the old to serve the new. Centuries later, another political upheaval reshaped the Parthenon again. In the early 13th century, after the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, Athens fell under the control of Frankish crusaders. The Parthenon became a Catholic church, serving the Latin Archbishop of Athens. Then came the Ottoman Empire. In 1458, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II completed his conquest of the Greek mainland, and Athens surrendered. By the 1460s, the Parthenon was transformed into a mosque. A minaret was added to the southwest corner, rising from the ancient marble steps. The interior was cleared of any remaining Christian imagery, and the building was reoriented once more, this time toward Mecca. The Parthenon, which had witnessed the rituals of classical paganism, Byzantine Christianity, and Frankish Catholicism, now echoed with a call to prayer. Each of these changes was abrupt, a direct result of political conquest and the imposition of a new ruling power. The architecture absorbed these shifts, its walls bearing the scars of new doors, blocked windows, and altered sanctuaries. Modern visitors walking among the ruins often see only the classical columns and the famous friezes, but beneath that serene exterior lies a history of continuous repurposing, a building that was never allowed to rest as a relic. It was a living space reshaped by each wave of conquerors who claimed the Acropolis for themselves. The Parthenon remains a symbol of ancient Greece, but its stones tell a story of how political change can rewrite the meaning of a place, turning a temple into a church into a mosque, and eventually into the monumental ruin we preserve today. What would it feel like to stand inside that space and sense the layers of belief that have soaked into the marble? A wall of crimson and gold rose from the heart of Beijing, a city within a city that no commoner could enter. The Forbidden City was conceived by the Ming Emperor Yongle in the early 15th century, and from 1406 to 1420, hundreds of thousands of workers shaped its defensive moats, marble bridges, and vast halls. Every detail was designed to reinforce the emperor's role as the son of heaven. The layout followed strict principles of symmetry and hierarchy, with the Hall of Supreme Harmony at the center, raised on a three-tiered white stone platform. Only the emperor could walk the central path. The entire complex was a physical diagram of cosmic order, a place where politics and spirituality merged into a single statement of absolute power. For over 2 centuries, the Ming dynasty ruled from this secluded palace, its walls shielding the imperial family from the world beyond. Then came the mid-1600s. In 1644, a rebel army swept through Beijing, and the last Ming emperor took his own life in a desperate act. The structures of the Forbidden City were not destroyed, but they suddenly stood empty, awaiting a new master. That master arrived from the northeast, the Manchu people, who had built a powerful state beyond the Great Wall. Led by the young Shunjai emperor, the Manchu Qing dynasty entered the Forbidden City and claimed it as their own. What followed was not a destruction of the old but a careful and deliberate remaking of it. The Qing rulers understood that to rule China, they had to appear Chinese, and the palace was the ultimate stage for that performance. They immediately launched a massive renovation and expansion program that would continue for decades. New halls were added, such as the Hall of Mental Cultivation, which became the private residence of successive emperors. The layout was altered in subtle but significant ways. The king-emperors shifted the center of gravity away from the grand outer courts and toward the inner residential quarters, where they conducted much of their daily business. They also built new structures like the Palace of Earthly Tranquility, which was renovated to serve Manchu shamanic rituals alongside traditional Confucian ceremonies. Entire sections were rebuilt, their roofs raised, their decoration made more elaborate, all to assert a legitimacy that was not inherited but claimed. This was a foreign dynasty, one that did not speak Chinese when it first took power, yet it transformed the Forbidden City into a symbol of its own rule. The building phases reveal a quiet but profound political upheaval. The Ming had built the palace to project an unchanging order. The king reshaped it to project continuity, even as they fundamentally rewrote the political script. They preserved the outer shell of Ming architecture while pouring new meaning into every courtyard and hall. The Forbidden City itself became a statement that the Manchu were not conquerors but rightful inheritors of the Celestial Empire. Every brick and beam they added was a political argument, a way to write their own story onto a landscape built by their predecessors. Walking through its vast courtyards today, you see layers of history stacked like the tiles on its roofs. The original Ming plan remains visible, but the Qing additions and modifications tell a story of how power can be claimed not by burning the old, but by carefully remaking it in a new image. What other imperial spaces have been quietly rewritten by those who came to rule from outside? Deep in the Guatemalan jungle, a city of stone and sky once reached for the heavens, then fell silent. The ancient Maya metropolis of Tikal rose to its greatest height in the 8th century under the ruler Jasorchan K-Adjective Wil I. He ordered the construction of massive temples that still pierce the forest canopy today, including Temple 1, a towering pyramid that marked his own resting place. Its steep stairs and jutting roof comb were designed to be seen from miles away, a declaration of power carved into the limestone bedrock of the lowlands. Building crews worked for decades, hauling stone, shaping blocks, and raising these monuments to the gods and to the rulers who channeled divine authority. Tikal became a center of trade, ritual, and political control, its plazas crowded with stelae celebrating victories over rival city-states. For a time, the city seemed unstoppable, its architecture a permanent monument to an enduring civilization. Then the building stopped. Around 900 of the Common Era, the great construction projects that had defined Tikal for centuries simply came to an end. No new pyramids rose, no new temples replaced the old. The royal workshops fell quiet, and the quarries that had echoed with the sound of stonecutters went still. This abrupt halt is one of the most dramatic signals in the archaeological record. It tells us that something fundamental had broken within Maya society. Researchers point to a combination of pressures that may have overwhelmed the city's ability to sustain itself. Long periods of drought likely weakened the agricultural system that fed tens of thousands of people. Competition and conflict with neighboring cities drained resources and disrupted trade routes. And internal tensions, perhaps between the ruling elite and the common population, may have erupted into unrest or even revolt. The careful political order that had allowed Jasorchan K-Adjective Wil and his successors to mobilize labor for monumental construction simply dissolved. Without that central authority, the city could not maintain its own identity. One by one, the royal families either left or lost their power. The great plazas grew quiet. The stone monuments, once painted in bright reds and blues, began to fade under the relentless jungle rain. By the year 1000, Tikal was largely abandoned, its temples standing as hollow reminders of a world that had collapsed under the weight of its own success. What makes Tikal so powerful as a story is not the grandeur of its peak but the suddenness of its end. The same society that raised temples to the sky could not adapt when the rains failed and the old alliances shattered. The buildings themselves record this tragedy not in words but in absence. The unfinished structures, the gaps in construction sequences, the lack of later additions all speak to a political system that failed its people. Walking among those ruins today, you sense a pause that never resumed, a civilization that reached its limit and could not find a way forward. What does it mean when a city stops building? It means the dream of the future has died. The limestone platforms of Chichen Itza tell a different story, one not of silence but of sudden reinvention. In its earliest phase during the 7th and 8th centuries, the city was shaped by the Puuc building style, a tradition that favored intricate stone mosaics, columned facades, and roof combs that seemed to float above the jungle. The structure known today as the nunnery stands as a perfect example of this earlier period. Its long, low buildings are covered in geometric patterns and masks of the rain god Chok, whose hooked nose curls across every surface. This was the architecture of a stable, locally rooted society, one that drew its inspiration from the hills to the west and a long lineage of Maya builders. Then the political map of the Yucatan was redrawn. Around the 10th century, a group known as the Itza arrived from the south or the west, possibly driven by the collapse of other Maya centers or by their own expansionist ambitions. They did not simply burn what stood before them. Instead, they reimagined Chichen Itza on a grander, more militaristic scale. The buildings that followed, like the towering pyramid known as El Castillo and the vast hall of the Temple of the Warriors, reveal a dramatic shift in both style and symbolism. Stone columns now rose in long rows, carved with images of warriors and plumed serpents. The feathered serpent god Cuculcan, a figure with strong ties to central Mexico, became the central deity, his image displayed on the staircases of El Castillo. The ball court, the largest in the Maya world, was expanded and decorated with scenes of authority and ritual. These were not subtle additions. They represented a complete reordering of the city's identity. The earlier Puuc buildings, with their careful stonework and regional motifs, were left standing, but they were now surrounded by a new architectural language that spoke of conquest and integration. The Itza had taken political control, and they expressed that dominance not by erasing the past but by building over it, literally and figuratively. The older structures became backdrop to a new center of power. This transformation was not a gradual evolution but a deliberate statement. Walking through Chichen Itza today, you can see the two worlds pressed together, the calm geometry of the nunnery and the dramatic verticality of El Castillo. One speaks of tradition, the other of takeover. The stones themselves record a moment when a city passed from one set of hands to another, and the builders who followed chose to announce that change in every column and every step. No city in the ancient Americas was as carefully planned as Teotihuacan. Its builders laid out a rigid grid oriented to the stars, with the Avenue of the Dead running straight through the center for over 2 miles. Along this grand corridor, they raised two of the largest pyramids ever constructed in the pre-Columbian world. The Pyramid of the Sun rose to over 200 feet, a massive stepped structure of stone and earth that dominated the skyline. The Pyramid of the Moon, slightly smaller but equally imposing, anchored the northern end of the avenue. Between them, elite residential compounds, painted in brilliant reds and ochres, housed the priests, rulers, and merchants who controlled a city of perhaps 100,000 people. For centuries, from the 1st century to the 6th century of the Common Era, Teotihuacan was the cultural and economic heart of Mesoamerica, its influence reaching far into modern-day Guatemala and Honduras. The architecture itself was a statement of order and permanence. Every building aligned with the grid, every plaza was designed for public ritual. The city seemed eternal. Then, around 550 to 600 of the Common Era, something broke. Evidence found by archaeologists tells a startling story of deliberate destruction. The elite structures along the Avenue of the Dead, including the palaces and temple complexes that had housed the ruling class, were systematically set ablaze. The fire was not accidental. It spread rapidly through the wooden roofs and thatch of the ceremonial center, and the heat was so intense that it turned stone floors to brittle fragments. Sculptures were toppled, murals were defaced. The Great Pyramids themselves were not destroyed, but the buildings that surrounded them, the administrative and religious heart of the city, were reduced to ash and rubble. This was not the work of an invading army from outside. No evidence of foreign weapons or fortified defenses has been found. Instead, the destruction targeted only the most important structures, the symbols of authority itself. Historians and archaeologists now believe that a massive internal upheaval tore the city apart, perhaps a revolt against the ruling elite, a civil war between rival factions, or a violent rejection of the political and religious order that had governed for so long. The aftermath was swift and final. Construction across Teotihuacan stopped almost completely. The workshops that had produced obsidian blades and fine pottery fell silent. The population began to dwindle, and within a few generations, the great city was largely abandoned. The grid that had once seemed so permanent was slowly reclaimed by grass and dust. What makes Teotihuacan's story so haunting is not the grandeur of its pyramids but the suddenness of its collapse from within. A society that had thrived for half a millennium turned on itself, and the stones that had symbolized stability became the evidence of a fracture that could not be repaired. Walking the Avenue of the Dead today, you feel the weight of that silence, a reminder that even the most carefully ordered world can shatter when the trust between rulers and the ruled finally breaks. Stone terraces rose from the plain of Persepolis like a staircase to the heavens. The Achaemenid kings, Darius I and his son Xerxes, began this ceremonial capital in the late 6th century before the Common Era, carving a vast platform into the rock of the region known today as Iran. They intended it not as a fortress or a market, but as a stage for empire. Every spring, representatives from dozens of conquered lands, from the Indus to the Nile, would climb the grand stairway of all nations, their hands clasped in respect, carrying gifts of gold, ivory, and rare animals. The walls of the Apadana Palace were lined with reliefs showing these delegates, each dressed in their own costume, a visual inventory of the world under Persian rule. The Gate of All Nations, flanked by colossal human-headed bulls, welcomed visitors into a complex of audience halls, treasuries, and royal quarters, all built from dark gray limestone and polished to a sheen that caught the desert sun. For over a century, the stonecutters and sculptors kept working, adding new palaces and expanding the platform. The King of Kings had declared that his capital would be a monument to unity and power, and every new column seemed to prove that the Achaemenid Empire would last forever. Then the world changed. In the year 330 before the Common Era, Alexander of Macedon marched his army across the Tigris and Euphrates, scattering the Persian forces at Gaugamela. He entered Persepolis not as a respectful visitor but as a conqueror seeking retribution for the Persian invasions of Greece a century earlier. After a brief stay, during which he reportedly celebrated his victory, the order was given. Fire swept through the grand halls, the cedar beams of the roof blazed, the great columns cracked in the heat, and the reliefs that had depicted the harmony of nations were blackened with soot. The destruction was swift and total. The workshops that had produced the finest stonework in the ancient world fell silent. No new palaces were begun. The platform that had symbolized the center of an empire was left to the wind and the dust. The abandonment was not gradual but immediate. Where once ambassadors had climbed the stairs bearing tribute, now only the jackal and the scorpion moved among the shattered capitals. The sudden halt of construction at Persepolis tells a story more powerful than any chronicle. The ambitious building program that had spanned generations was cut off in a single night. Not because the stone had run out or the treasury had emptied, but because the political system that had sustained it, the Achaemenid monarchy itself, had been defeated and replaced by a new order that had no interest in continuing its work. The ruins today stand as a stark reminder that even the most magnificent capital is only as permanent as the empire that builds it. The silent columns, the empty gateways, the unfinished bases that still bear the marks of the chisel, all of them speak of a world that was halted mid-sentence, its story left unfinished on the plain. While Persepolis lay in ashes, Babylon was being reborn under a new king. Nebuchadnezzar II, who ruled from 605 to 562 before the Common Era, transformed the ancient city of Hammurabi into a wonder of the ancient world. He rebuilt the Ishtar Gate, a towering entrance sheathed in deep blue-glazed bricks that shimmered like a river in the sun. Along its surface, rows of striding lions and mythical dragons emerged from the glaze, their bodies molded in high relief and fired with brilliant color. The processional way that led through the gate was lined with walls of the same vivid blue, each panel a statement of royal power and divine favor. Beyond the gate, the king constructed palaces and temples on a scale that had never been attempted in Mesopotamia. The famous hanging gardens, if they were indeed built in Babylon, were said to rise on layered terraces planted with trees and flowers, a mountain of greenery in the flat plain of the Euphrates. Everything about Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon spoke of a confident, unchallenged empire, a node of control that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. The builders worked for decades, raising ziggurats, fortifying walls, and organizing the city into a perfect rectangle divided by canals. This was the Babylon that later writers would remember as the capital of a golden age. Then Alexander of Macedon arrived. After his conquest of the Persian Empire, Alexander entered Babylon in 331 before the Common Era, and he did not burn it. Instead, he was welcomed by the city's priests and officials, and he chose to make it the capital of his new empire. For a brief moment, it seemed that Babylon would continue as a center of power under a new master. But Alexander's sudden death in 323 threw everything into uncertainty. The empire fractured, and Babylon passed into the hands of the Seleucid dynasty, Hellenistic rulers who spoke Greek and carried Greek culture across the east. Under the Seleucids, the city changed once more. A Greek theater was carved into the heart of the old Mesopotamian city, its tiered seats rising above the flat ground where Babylonian astronomers had once charted the stars. Administrative buildings with columned porticos and classical facades were erected in the city center, their design taken from Athens and Antioch. The old Babylonian temples were still maintained, but now they stood alongside gymnasiums and civic squares that looked like they belonged on a Greek island. The street grid itself was shifted, new roads aligned not with the old processional way but with Hellenistic principles of geometry. This was not a gradual evolution but a deliberate political statement. The Seleucid rulers were signaling that Babylon was now part of a Greek world, governed by Greek laws and Greek ideas. The clay bricks that had been stamped with the name of Nebuchadnezzar now shared space with stone inscriptions in Greek script. The gods of Babylon were joined by Zeus and Apollo. The shift from Mesopotamian to Greek control was written into the architecture itself, a quiet but unmistakable overlay of one political order upon another. The Ishtar Gate remained, a brilliant blue monument to a vanished age, but the city around it had become something new. Walking through the ruins of Babylon today, you can still see the foundations of the Greek theater, its stones resting on layers of older brick. The two worlds are pressed together, and the story they tell is one of how conquest can reshape a city without erasing its past, only adding a new chapter that changes the meaning of everything that came before. A circular harbor lined with warship sheds once guarded the heart of Carthage. This was the naval stronghold of the Punic world, a city that rivaled Rome for dominance over the Mediterranean. From the 5th to the 2nd century before the Common Era, Carthaginian engineers perfected a design that had no equal. The harbor was actually two connected basins, an outer one for merchant vessels and an inner one reserved for the war fleet. Around the inner basin, they built a ring of stone docks, each one covered by a roof and capable of holding a warship. Above these sheds, a second level provided storage for sails and rigging, while the entire complex was shielded by massive walls that rose directly from the water. The fortifications of Carthage itself were equally impressive, a triple line of walls that stretched over 20 miles and reached heights of 40 feet. Within those walls, barracks housed thousands of soldiers and stables held hundreds of war elephants. The city seemed unbreakable, a fortress built by a maritime empire that had grown rich on trade across North Africa, Iberia, and the islands of the Western Sea. For centuries, Carthage held its own against Greek colonies and rival Numidian kingdoms, and above all against the rising power of Rome. Then came the series of conflicts known as the Punic Wars, and the final act in 1406 before the Common Era. After a siege that lasted 3 years, Roman legions under Scipio Aemilianus breached the outer walls. The fighting was fierce and the outcome decisive. The city was systematically taken apart, buildings were toppled, the harbor was deliberately filled with rubble to make it unusable, and the great walls were torn down. The Roman Senate decreed that Carthage must cease to exist as a political entity, and the land was even symbolically plowed and salted to ensure nothing would grow there again. The destruction was not merely military but ideological. Rome wanted to erase not only the city but the memory of its power. For a generation, the site lay empty, a scar on the African coast. Then, a century later, Rome changed its mind. In the year 122 before the Common Era, a new colony called Colonia Ionia Carthago was established on the same ground. But the Romans did not rebuild the old Punic city. They built something entirely new. The circular harbor was dredged and restored, but now it served a Roman fleet, not a Carthaginian one. The old Punic grid of narrow, winding streets was replaced by a Roman plan of straight avenues and ordered blocks. At the center of the new city, a forum rose, a broad open space surrounded by colonnades and public buildings. An amphitheater was carved into the hillside, large enough to hold thousands of spectators who would watch games imported from Rome. Public baths, with their heated floors and vaulted ceilings, were constructed along the main thoroughfare. Aqueducts brought fresh water from the mountains, and villas with mosaic floors spread across the surrounding countryside. Every stone of this new Carthage was a statement of Roman control. The Punic past was not honored or integrated. It was buried beneath a landscape that spoke Latin and followed Roman law. The abrupt break between the two building phases tells a story of total conquest. Where other cities had been gradually transformed by new rulers, Carthage was first erased and then replaced from scratch. The political upheaval was absolute. The original inhabitants were either killed or sold into slavery, and the new settlers were veterans and colonists sent from Italy. This was colonization in its most direct form, a blank slate on which Rome wrote its own vision. Walking through the ruins of Roman Carthage today, you see the amphitheater, the forum, the baths, all built on top of a city that was deliberately forgotten. Only traces of the Punic harbor remain, a few stone blocks that hint at the naval power that once challenged Rome. The two layers of history are separated not by centuries of gradual change, but by a single moment of violent rupture. The rebuilding of Carthage is a reminder that sometimes the most revealing architecture is the one that replaces what came before, a new city laid directly over the ashes of the old. What other colonies were built on the graves of nations that Rome decided had to disappear? beneath a small hill in northwest Turkey, lies a city built and destroyed 9 times across 3 millennia. The earliest layers, known as Troy II, date back to around 2500 before the Common Era. Its builders raised massive stone walls over 15 feet thick, with sloping ramparts and a great gate that could be barred against attackers. Inside, a royal palace stood on a raised platform, its Megaron Hall lined with wooden columns and painted walls. This was a wealthy settlement, a center of trade that controlled the sea route between the Aegean and the Black Sea. But around 2200 before the Common Era, fire swept through those walls. The thick stones cracked, the wooden roofs collapsed, and the palace was buried under ash. Yet the site was not abandoned. New settlers arrived, raising their own structures on top of the rubble, adding a new layer to the growing tell. Centuries passed and the hill rose higher. By the time of Troy the 6th and 7th, around 1700 to 1200 before the Common Era, the city had grown into a fortified citadel with a different plan. The walls were now built with careful stonework, their foundations sunk deep into the earlier ruins. Inside, long rows of houses pressed against the fortifications, their stone foundations supporting mud brick walls. The layout was tighter, more defensive, suggesting a community that felt the pressure of a hostile world. Then around 1180 before the Common Era, another destruction by fire left a thick layer of ash and debris at Troy the 7th. Bones of fallen individuals were found in the streets, and arrowheads lay scattered among the burned remains. Historians connect this violent end to the conflict remembered in the poems of Homer, the Trojan War. Whether or not the epic version is historically accurate, the physical evidence points to a catastrophic event that ended the city's second Great Era. After that fire, the site lay mostly abandoned for several centuries. Then a new political order arrived. Greek colonists from the island of Lesbos settled on the hill around 700 before the Common Era, building a small sanctuary on the very summit. They dedicated it to Athena, and its Doric columns rose directly above the older ash layers. Over the following centuries, the Greek town expanded. A temple was built, a theater carved into the southern slope, and new houses spread across the plain. The old citadel was now just a sacred precinct, a shrine to a legendary past. Then came the Romans. In the 1st century before the Common Era, the city of Ilium was founded on the same ground, and Roman engineers leveled parts of the Greek sanctuary to build a forum, a bathhouse, and a colonnaded street. They added a new temple to Athena, larger than the Greek one, and paved the road leading to the harbor. The old walls of Troy the 6th were still visible, but they were now surrounded by Roman arches and marble pavements. Each layer of this hill represents a different political world, each one built on the ashes of the one before. The massive fortifications of the Bronze Age speak of a society that prepared for siege. The Greek sanctuary speaks of reverence for a distant memory. The Roman town speaks of imperial administration and new wealth. Walking the site today, you stand on a mound that is itself a chronicle of conflict and rebuilding, a place where the building phases do not just tell a story of gradual change but of repeated rupture, and of the enduring human impulse to rebuild on the ruins of what was lost. Perched on a lonely plateau above the Dead Sea, Masada was never meant to be a battlefield. In the final decades before the Common Era, Herod the Great transformed this isolated rock into one of the most lavish royal retreats in the ancient world. He ordered the construction of a palace that seemed to defy gravity, clinging to the northern cliff in 3 cascading terraces. Each level contained grand reception halls, private bathhouses with heated floors, and open porticos that offered a sweeping view of the desert and the salt sea far below. To make this fortress livable in an environment where rain fell only a few times a year, Herod's engineers carved a network of cisterns into the bedrock, each one capable of holding millions of gallons of water. Channels and aqueducts guided every precious drop of runoff into these underground reservoirs, ensuring that the palace would never go thirsty. Massive storerooms lined the western edge of the plateau, filled with enough grain, wine, and oil to support a small army for years. Everything about Masada was designed for self-sufficiency and comfort, a secure haven where the king could escape the intrigues of Jerusalem and the pressures of Roman influence. For decades, the palace functioned exactly as Herod intended, a quiet symbol of royal power and engineering skill. But within a century of his death, the political world of Judea had been torn apart by rebellion against Roman rule. In the year 66 of the Common Era, a group of Jewish rebels known as the Sicarii took control of Masada. They turned the royal retreat into a stronghold, storing weapons in the elegant halls and barricading the winding paths that led up the cliff. The transformation was sudden and complete. The palace that had once hosted banquets and political negotiations now housed fighters preparing for a prolonged stand. The rebellion spread across the region, and by the early 70s, the Roman army had crushed most of the resistance. Only a few strongholds remained, and Masada was the most formidable. In 73, the Roman governor Flavius Silva marched at the head of the 10th Legion, thousands of soldiers accompanied by prisoners of war who would serve as laborers. The Romans did not attempt a direct assault on the nearly vertical cliffs. Instead, they built a siege wall that completely encircled the base of the plateau, a rampart of stone and earth 8 feet thick, punctuated by 8 camps where the legionaries waited. Their most ambitious construction was a massive assault ramp, an inclined plane of packed earth and timber that climbed the western slope, rising nearly 300 feet. This ramp was a staggering feat of military engineering, but its purpose was grim. It allowed the Romans to bring a battering ram and a siege tower directly against the fortress wall. The site that had been a peaceful retreat was now a stage for one of the most famous sieges of antiquity. The Roman ramp still survives today, a sloping scar on the desert landscape, a permanent reminder of the political upheaval that transformed a palace into a target. When the battering ram finally breached the wall, the Romans found that the defenders had made a final, collective choice that would echo through history. The archaeological evidence, including the remains of the ramp, the siege camps, and the storerooms still filled with supplies, all point to a story of a community that had prepared for a long siege but ultimately faced an impossible decision. Masada stands now not as a monument to Herod's ambition, but as a symbol of the violent disruption of the world he had known, a place where the stones themselves speak of a sudden and irreversible change. A different kind of wall snakes across mountains and deserts for thousands of miles. The Great Wall we know today from photographs is mostly a Ming Dynasty creation of stone and brick, but the story of this structure begins much earlier in the soil of the Qin dynasty. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, ordered the connection of older frontier barriers into a single defensive line. His builders used a technique called rammed earth. They packed layers of clay, gravel, and sand between wooden forms, pounding them until the material became as hard as rock. These early sections were not tall enough to stop an army, but they served as barriers against raiders and as signaling platforms where smoke and fire could warn of approaching danger. The rammed earth walls rose quickly, but they were vulnerable to rain and erosion. Within a few centuries, many sections crumbled, and later dynasties let them fall into disrepair. The wall was not a continuous monument but a series of intermittent barriers, and for over 1,000 years, no single dynasty made it a priority. Then came the 14th century, and the Ming dynasty faced a political landscape that had shifted dramatically. The Mongol Empire, which had ruled China under the Yuan dynasty, had been overthrown, but the threat of a Mongol resurgence remained real. Beyond the northern steppes, new powers were rising, including the Manchu tribes who would later conquer China. The Ming emperors understood that the old rammed earth walls were no longer adequate. The invention of gunpowder and the use of cannon by steppe armies meant that a simple earth barrier could be breached too easily. In response, the Ming launched the largest construction project in Chinese history. They rebuilt the wall on a scale never seen before, using stone blocks and fired bricks set in lime mortar. Watchtowers rose every few hundred yards, their roofs designed to shelter garrison troops and store gunpowder. The wall itself was widened so that soldiers could march along the top, and crenellations provided cover for archers and later for hand cannons. The Ming builders did not simply patch the old wall. They created a completely new defensive system, with strategic passes like Shanhaiguan on the coast and Jiayuguan in the distant west. These were not just gates but fortified complexes with multiple lines of defense, barracks, and grain stores. The urgency of this project tells a clear story of political upheaval. The Ming dynasty had expelled the Mongols from the capital, but the steppe remained a source of constant tension. Raids from the north disrupted trade, killed civilians, and undermined the legitimacy of the emperor. Every new watchtower, every brick laid, was a response to the fear that the invader might return. But even as the Ming poured resources into the wall, the Manchu people to the northeast were consolidating their own power. By the early 17th century, the wall had become a symbol of Ming determination, yet it could not stop the political forces gathering beyond it. When the Manchu finally broke through in 1644, they did not do so by assaulting the wall. They were let through by a Ming general at Shanhaiguan who switched sides. The wall, for all its stone and brick, could not prevent the internal collapse that made such a betrayal possible. After the Manchu established the Qing dynasty, they stopped maintaining the wall. It was no longer needed because the steppe was now part of their empire. The great barrier that had evolved under pressure for centuries fell silent, its watchtowers empty, its bricks slowly pulled away by local people for their own houses. Standing on the wall today, you see both the ambition of the Ming and the frailty of their political system. The earliest rammed earth sections are gone, buried beneath the later stone. But the Ming layers survive because they were built with urgency, a direct answer to a threat that never went away. The wall is not a single moment of construction, but a continuous story of adaptation. Each new phase a response to the changing politics of the steppe. It reminds us that even the mightiest fortifications are only as strong as the political will that drives their builders. A city carved from the living rock, Petra appears like a mirage at the end of a narrow canyon. Its most famous monument, the treasury, was not a bank but a royal tomb, chiseled directly into the sandstone face sometime around the 1st century before the Common Era. The Nabateans who built it were masters of hydraulic engineering, channeling water through clay pipes and cisterns to sustain a population in the middle of the desert. They cut facades that blended Egyptian, Greek, and Assyrian styles, creating a visual language that announced their control over the caravan routes carrying frankincense, myrrh, and spices from the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean. The monastery, larger and higher up the mountain, followed a similar pattern, its massive doorway and crowning urn signaling the wealth and ambition of a kingdom that had grown rich by taxing every passing merchant. For over a century, the Nabateans expanded their capital, adding temples, tombs, and a theater that could seat several thousand. The city was not just a trading post but a political center, ruled by kings who maintained their independence through diplomacy and military strength. Then came the year 106 of the Common Era. The Roman Emperor Trajan annexed the Nabatean kingdom, turning it into the province of Arabia Patria. On paper, the Romans absorbed Petra into their empire, but in practice they quickly shifted the major trade routes. Instead of passing through Petra, caravans began to follow routes that bypassed the city entirely, heading to new Roman ports on the Red Sea and up the Euphrates River. The economic lifeblood of Petra was diverted elsewhere. The result was not destruction but a slow, quiet abandonment. The Romans did not build their own monuments in Petra. They did not erect a forum or a basilica or an aqueduct. They left the rock-cut tombs standing, but they put no new energy into the city. The lack of later Roman construction is itself a powerful statement. It tells us that Petra had become irrelevant. The political center of the province moved to the newly founded city of Bosra, far to the north. Petra was left to fade. Over the following centuries, the population dwindled. The water channels that had once kept the city alive fell into disrepair. Sand and wind began to erase the edges of the carved facades. By the time of the Islamic conquests in the 7th century, Petra was largely empty, a ghost city known only to local Bedouin. What makes Petra's story so telling is not the grandeur of its monuments but the silence that followed. The Romans could have built a new temple or a bathhouse, as they did in so many other conquered cities, but they chose not to. That choice reveals more than any inscription. Petra had been marginalized, its political importance stripped away as quickly as its trade. The rock-cut tombs remain, beautiful and haunting, but they are monuments to a kingdom that was simply bypassed by the currents of history. The sandstone colonnades of Palmyra stretched for nearly a mile across the Syrian desert, a testament to a city that grew wealthy by taxing every caravan that passed between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean. Its monumental arch, rising at the bend of the Great Street, was not a gate in the traditional sense but a ceremonial divider, its 3 passageways designed to frame the approach to the most sacred precinct. Beyond it stood the Temple of Bel, a vast sanctuary completed in the early 2nd century of the Common Era. Its towering cella, or inner chamber, was surrounded by a colonnade of 15 Corinthian columns, and its doorway alone reached nearly 40 feet high. The builders had blended local Syrian traditions with Roman architectural vocabulary, creating a style that declared Palmyra's unique position, an independent kingdom that had negotiated its place within the Roman sphere without being fully absorbed. For over a century, the city thrived as a neutral hub, its merchants speaking Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, its coins bearing the images of both Palmyran gods and Roman emperors. The caravans brought silk from China, spices from India, and frankincense from Arabia, and the profits poured into the construction of temples, thermae, and a theater that seated several thousand. The building program was steady and confident, each new structure reinforcing the message that Palmyra was a permanent fixture of the eastern trade routes. Then came the middle of the 3rd century, and a political crisis that would unravel everything the city had built. The Roman Empire was tearing itself apart with civil wars and external invasions, and in the vacuum of authority, a Palmyran leader named Odenathus rose to defend the eastern frontier. He defeated the Persian forces that had threatened the region, and in gratitude, the Roman emperor granted him extraordinary powers. But when Odenathus was assassinated around 267, his widow Zenobia took control, and she saw an opportunity that no previous Palmyran ruler had dared to seize. She declared herself queen and began to expand her territory, conquering Egypt and parts of Anatolia, and even minting coins with her son's image instead of the Roman emperor's. This was not a rebellion of desperation but a calculated bid to create an independent Palmyran empire that would control the wealth of the East. The building program in Palmyra itself changed during this period. New defensive towers were added to the city walls, and the great colonnaded street was extended, but the work was rushed, the stonework less refined than the earlier phases. Zenobia's ambition was already shaping the architecture, but the response from Rome was swift and devastating. Emperor Aurelian, determined to reunite the empire, marched eastward. He defeated Zenobia's forces in 2 battles near Antioch and then at Emesa, and by 273 he had laid siege to Palmyra itself. The city fell, and Zenobia was captured. What Aurelian did next changed the character of the city permanently. He did not simply take prisoners and leave. He ordered the systematic destruction of Palmyra's defensive walls and the execution of the leaders who had supported Zenobia. The Temple of Bel was stripped of its treasures and the Great Arch was damaged, but the most telling act was the construction that followed. After the rebellion was crushed, Roman engineers returned to Palmyra not to restore it to its former glory, but to fortify it against future insurrection. They rebuilt the walls, but they made them lower and weaker than the originals, a deliberate downgrade that ensured the city could never again resist imperial authority. New barracks were constructed for a permanent Roman garrison, and a small temple was dedicated to the emperor's genius. The scale of construction shrank dramatically. No new theaters or grand public spaces were added. The colonnaded street was left with gaps, the fallen columns never fully replaced. The city that had once hosted caravans from 3 continents was now reduced to a military outpost, its economy dependent on the presence of soldiers rather than on trade. The building phases of Palmyra tell a story of imperial backlash that was not simply punitive but architectural. Rome did not want to erase Palmyra, but it wanted to ensure that Palmyra could never again dream of independence. The new fortifications were a permanent reminder of who held the power, and the lack of investment in civic structures signaled that the city was no longer a hub of civilization but a controlled space. Over the following decades, the caravans found other routes and the population dwindled. The stones that had once echoed with the voices of merchants and pilgrims fell silent. The Great Arch and the Temple of Bel remained, but they stood in a city that had been deliberately diminished, its political soul crushed by the very empire that had once allowed it to flourish. The ruins today preserve both phases, the confident, decorative architecture of the first 2 centuries and the stark, functional additions of the Roman reoccupation. Between them lies the trace of a queen who dared to challenge Rome and of an emperor who made sure no one would ever try again. The limestone blocks of Sacsayhuaman fit together so tightly that not even a blade of grass can slip between them. High above the city of Cusco, these enormous stones form zigzagging walls that have survived centuries of weather and war. Each boulder was carefully shaped by Inca masons during the reign of Pachacuti in the mid-1500s, their surfaces curved and faceted to lock into neighboring pieces without any mortar. The largest stones weigh well over 100 tons, yet they were quarried miles away and dragged uphill by thousands of laborers. The purpose of the complex remains debated among scholars, but most agree it served as a ceremonial stronghold, a place where the ruler could demonstrate both his connection to the gods and his command over the land. The walls rise in 3 parallel tiers, their precise angles designed to resist the earthquakes that shake the Andes. For a few decades, this stone masterpiece stood as a symbol of Inca power and engineering genius, a statement that the Empire of the Sun could shape the earth itself to its will. Then the Spanish arrived. In 1533, Francisco Pizarro captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, and within a few years, the conquest of the highlands was underway. By 1536, the Spanish had taken Cusco, and they immediately began to remake the city in their own image. The Inca walls of Sacsayhuaman, which had never been breached in battle, were now systematically dismantled. The Spanish did not destroy the entire complex, but they targeted the most accessible blocks, the ones that could be easily hauled down the hill into the valley below. These stones were carted away to build the foundations of new Spanish churches, convents, and administrative buildings in the heart of Cusco. If you walk through the historic center of that city today, you will see countless structures where Inca stonework forms the first few feet of the wall, topped by adobe or brickwork from the colonial period. The same stones that once supported a temple to the sun now support the walls of a Catholic cathedral. This was not a simple matter of convenience. It was a deliberate political act, a way of claiming the physical symbols of the old order and turning them into the foundation of a new one. The quarrying of Sacsayhuaman continued for generations. Spanish authorities issued permits for the removal of stone, and local laborers were forced to participate in the dismantling of their own heritage. The result was a site that looks broken and incomplete, missing entire sections where the largest blocks were extracted. Yet the remaining walls still stand, their zigzag lines rising against the sky, a record of both the Inca achievement and the rupture that followed. What strikes visitors today is not only the scale of the stones but the abruptness of the transition. The 3 levels of the fortress were never finished. The building program that had been underway under the last Inca emperors was halted midstream. The Spanish conquest meant that no new Inca structures would rise, and the old ones would be slowly but purposefully scattered across the colonial city below. The violence of this transformation was not expressed in fire and smoke, as it was at Persepolis or Carthage, but in the quiet, methodical removal of stone after stone. Each block that was pried loose and carried down the hill was a small act of erasure. The conquerors were not just taking building materials, they were dismantling the physical memory of a civilization. The walls that remain at Sacsayhuaman are the ones that were too difficult to move, too high up or too deeply set to be worth the effort. They stand today as a testimony to what was lost and to what still endures despite that loss. Looking at those massive, perfectly fitted stones, you are seeing not only a marvel of ancient engineering, but also a document of how one political order can systematically unbuild the monuments of another. The gaps in the wall are as meaningful as the stones themselves. Across the high plains of Bolivia, a city of stone once commanded the southern Andes with an authority that predated the Inca by half a millennium. Tiwanaku rose between the 6th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, its builders shaping massive blocks of volcanic stone into monuments that still puzzle researchers today. The Gate of the Sun, carved from a single slab of andesite weighing over 10 tons, stands as the centerpiece of this ancient complex. Its central figure, a staff-bearing deity wearing a headdress of radiating rays, stares out over a plaza where processions once gathered. Nearby, the Acapana Pyramid rises in 7-step terraces, each faced with fitted stone and originally anchored by retaining walls that channeled rainwater through a sophisticated drainage system. The entire site was aligned with the movements of the sun and stars, a physical diagram of a cosmology that placed Tiwanaku at the center of the world. For 4 centuries, this city thrived. Its farmers drained the flooded plains of Lake Titicaca to create raised fields that produced abundant crops. Its artisans worked copper, bronze, and gold into ornaments that traded across the highlands. The political order that supported this construction must have been stable and powerful, capable of organizing labor on a scale that rivaled anything in the ancient Americas. Then, around the year 1000, the building stopped. No new monuments were raised, the quarries fell silent. The great platform of the Acapana was left unfinished in places, its upper stones never fully set. The city that had been the heart of a civilization simply emptied. The cause remains debated among researchers. A prolonged drought may have disrupted the agricultural system that sustained the population. Internal social tensions could have fractured the ruling authority. What is clear is that the political structure that had made Tiwanaku possible dissolved, and the city entered a long period of silence. Its stone monuments stood empty, weathered by wind and rain, their purpose slowly forgotten by the people who remained in the scattered villages of the Altiplano. Centuries passed, then, in the 15th century, a new power rose in the Andes. The Inca Empire expanded from its heartland in Cusco, conquering territory across Peru and into Bolivia. When Inca armies reached the shores of Lake Titicaca, they encountered the ruins of Tiwanaku. Instead of ignoring or destroying these ancient stones, the Inca did something unexpected. They adopted Tiwanaku as a sacred site. Inca rulers and priests made pilgrimages to the Gate of the Sun, performing ceremonies in the shadow of the old deity figure. They added their own structures to the complex, building a small temple of fine Inca masonry directly atop one of the older platforms. They reinterpreted the site as the place of creation, the spot where the sun god Inti had emerged to begin the lineage of the Inca. This was not conquest but appropriation. The Inca were deliberately linking their own political legitimacy to a fallen empire, claiming its sacred authority as their own. They did not build over Tiwanaku in the way the Spanish would later build over Inca walls. Instead, they inserted themselves into the existing narrative, treating the abandoned stones as a foundation for their own identity. The layers of construction at Tiwanaku tell a story of how one civilization can be resurrected in the imagination of another, its ruins transformed from empty relics into living symbols of power. The Gate of the Sun still stands, carved by hands that worked 1,000 years ago, but the meaning of that carved figure has shifted with every generation that has gazed upon it. The Inca saw their own sun god in that ancient face. Today, we see a record of how political ambition can reach across centuries to claim the past. What other ruins have been reborn in the minds of those who came after, their stones speaking not of their own time but of the needs of a later age? The hieroglyphic stairway of Copan rises in a cascade of over 2,000 carved glyphs, the longest known text from the ancient Maya world. This remarkable monument was commissioned by the 13th king of the city, Uaxaclajun Ubi adjective Aahk adjective Awiil, whose name means something like 18 rabbit. He ruled during the early 8th century, a period when Copan had grown into a powerful city-state at the eastern edge of the Maya region. The hieroglyphic stairway was part of a larger renovation of the city's central plaza, which included a step pyramid that towered above the surrounding plazas and temples. The king intended these structures to immortalize his reign and his dynastic accomplishments. The stairway itself tells the history of Copan's ruling line, each step a chapter in the story of a family that claimed descent from the gods. The work was careful and deliberate. Masons carved the limestone blocks with a precision that allowed the text to flow continuously up the pyramid, a permanent record written in stone. For years, this ambitious building program continued, reshaping the heart of the city and proclaiming the power of its ruler to all who gathered in the plaza. Then came the year 738 of the Common Era, and a rupture that no amount of carved stone could prevent. The rival city of Quirigua, located about 50 miles to the north, had long been a subordinate ally of Copan. But under its own ambitious king, Coax Sky, Quirigua began to assert its independence. The conflict came to a head when Uaxaclajun Ubi adjective Aahk adjective Awiil marched against Quirigua, determined to reassert his authority. The battle that followed did not go as he had planned. He was captured in a confrontation that shifted the political balance of the entire region. Instead of returning to Copan in triumph, he was taken to Quirigua and, according to the evidence of later monuments, met his end there. The consequences for Copan were immediate and devastating. The building projects that had defined the reign of the 13th king simply stopped. The hieroglyphic stairway was left incomplete in places, its final steps lacking the carved text that would have concluded the dynastic story. The step pyramid nearby shows signs of construction that was halted mid-phase, with blocks left unfaced and sections of the platform never finished. The royal workshops that had produced such elaborate sculpture fell silent. No new stelae were raised to celebrate victories because there were no victories to celebrate. This abrupt cessation of building reveals a sudden political collapse that went beyond the loss of a single ruler. The capture of the king and the defeat of his army shattered the authority of Copan's ruling dynasty. The new king who took the throne, a figure named K-adjective A-H K-adjective Joplaj Chan K-adjective A-W-I-I-L, did not have the same power or resources. He managed to restore some order, but the great ambitious projects of his predecessor were never resumed. The hieroglyphic stairway remained a monument to a king who had failed, its proud text a record of a dynasty that had been humbled. The step pyramid stood as a tomb for an unfinished vision. For the next few decades, Copan continued to exist as a city, but the energy that had driven its golden age was drained away. The steady rhythm of construction, the expansion of plazas, the carving of new stelae, all of it slowed to a trickle. The stones that had been meant to carry the king's story into eternity now stood as a memorial to the moment that story was interrupted. Walking among the ruins of Copan today, you can still see the marks of that interruption. The hieroglyphic stairway has been carefully restored in some sections, but its gaps are visible, spaces where the narrative was never completed. The step pyramid rises in terraces that seem to await a final layer that never arrived. The entire site carries a sense of pause, a question left hanging. What would the king have added next if he had been allowed to continue? That question can never be answered because the political world of the 8th century Maya was too fragile to protect even its greatest achievements. A single battle fought miles away was enough to silence the chisels of Copan and to freeze its monuments in time. The ruins remind us that the most ambitious building projects are always at the mercy of the politics that sustain them. And when those politics shift, the stones are left to tell a story that their builders never intended. The Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque rises from the jungle floor like a layered question etched in stone. Its stepped pyramid supports a 5-sectioned roof comb that still bears traces of original red paint, and at its summit, a small sanctuary encloses panels covered in one of the longest single Maya texts ever found. Those glyphs tell the story of K-adjective INICHJ ANAB adjective Pakal, the king who ascended the throne in the year 615 of the Common Era at just 12 years old. During his reign of nearly 7 decades, Palenque underwent a transformation that pushed the city to the peak of its cultural and political influence. Pakal ordered the construction of the Temple of the Inscriptions not only as a sanctuary for the gods but as his own final resting place. In 1952, excavators discovered a hidden stairway leading deep into the pyramid, descending to a burial chamber that held the king's remains. A carved sarcophagus lid shows Pakal surrounded by cosmic symbols, his position in the afterlife secured by the elaborate building program he had overseen. Other structures from his reign, including the palace with its unique 4-story tower that still stands, filled the central plaza with a sense of order and ambition. The city was a center of art, astronomy, and diplomacy, its stelae and altars recording alliances and rituals that linked Palenque to other Maya kingdoms. For decades, the building continued. New temples rose, plazas were expanded, and the population grew. Then, in the early 9th century, the rhythm broke. The last dated monument at Palenque was carved in the year 799 of the Common Era. After that, no new inscriptions were added, no stelae were raised. Construction on several structures, including a large palace platform and parts of the Temple of the Cross Group, was left unfinished. Buildings that had been planned for expansion stopped mid-phase, their upper stones never set, their facades incomplete. The workshops that had produced the finest ceramics and jade carvings fell silent. What caused this abrupt halt remains debated among researchers, but the pattern is clear: a period of political instability, perhaps involving a dynastic crisis or external pressure, sapped the city of the authority needed to sustain its ambitious projects. The evidence points not to a slow decline but to a sudden collapse of the ruling structure. The incomplete terraces and empty quarries at Palenque are not signs of a peaceful winding down. They are signals of a rupture, a moment when the political system that had supported elite construction simply stopped functioning. The city was not gradually abandoned by a diminishing population. It was rapidly depopulated, its rulers gone, its commoners dispersing into the surrounding hills. The jungle moved in quickly, vines and roots threading through the unfinished stonework, claiming back what had been carved. Standing today in the plaza below the Temple of the Inscriptions, you see a monument to a king who prepared for eternity, yet the city around him could not complete its own story. The gaps in the stonework speak of a world that did not fade away but was interrupted, its final chapter left unwritten in the very walls that were meant to record it. 7 Moai once faced the rising sun on the island of Rapa Nui, known to many as Easter Island. Around the year 1400, the islanders quarried volcanic tuff from the slopes of Rono Roroku and transported these massive stone figures across the landscape to stand on Ahu platforms. Ahu Akivi was unique among these sites because its moai were not placed along the coast but inland, and they were oriented to face the sunset during the spring equinox. Each statue was carved with elongated ears, long noses, and hands resting on the belly, following the same stylistic tradition that marked the island's great sculptural era. For generations, these 7 figures stood as silent witnesses to a society that had organized itself to achieve remarkable engineering feats. The work of quarrying, moving, and raising these figures required coordination across the entire island, a reflection of a social structure that could mobilize labor and resources on a grand scale. The islanders lived in a complex world of clan competition and cooperation, but the monuments themselves suggest a shared belief system that bound the communities together. Then, sometime in the 17th century, that world began to fracture. The delicate balance of Rapa Nui society collapsed under the weight of environmental strain and political tension. The island's forests, which had provided timber for canoe building and for transporting statues, were largely gone. Soil erosion reduced crop yields, and the once abundant seabird populations had declined. These pressures did not lead to a quiet fading. They triggered a violent upheaval within the society itself. Evidence shows that many of the moai across the island were deliberately toppled from their Ahu platforms. At Ahu Akivi, all 7 statues were pulled down, their faces broken against the stone altar. The toppling was not the result of an earthquake or erosion. It was the work of human hands carried out during a period of intense clan warfare that shattered the old order. Clan groups who had once collaborated in the building of these monuments now turned against each other. The statues that had represented ancestral authority and the power of rival lineages became targets. Toppling an enemy's moai was a way of breaking that lineage's spiritual claim to the land. The destruction was systematic. Statues were knocked forward, their necks snapping at the point where the massive head met the body. Some were left lying face down, their carved eyes no longer gazing out over the island. In the chaos that followed, the old religious and political system that had supported the statue cult simply dissolved. The islanders stopped quarrying new moai. The great unfinished figures still lie in the crater of Rono Roroku, abandoned mid-carving, their shapes barely emerging from the rock. The phase of destruction at Ahu Akivi reveals a society that had turned on its own symbols. The same hands that had once shaped the volcanic stone with care now pulled it down in anger. On this tiny island, the monuments tell a story of a community that could not adapt fast enough to the changes it had set in motion. The fallen moai are not just evidence of conflict. They are a monument to a breakdown of cooperation that left the landscape littered with the remains of a shared identity. Walking among those toppled figures, one sees the jagged line between creation and destruction, a line that was crossed when a society that had once raised stones to the sky found itself unable to raise itself from the ruins of its own making. Across the vast Pacific, another civilization built its capital not on land but on the sea itself. Nan Madol rises from the shallows off the coast of Pohnpei, a city of artificial islands linked by canals, its walls formed from columns of black basalt stacked like the trunks of petrified trees. The Sordilor dynasty, which ruled from around 1100 to 1500 of the Common Era, directed the construction of this watery stronghold. They commanded thousands of laborers to haul massive basalt logs from the mainland, floating them on rafts and then dragging them into position to create a network of over 90 small islets. The central complex, known as Madol Pao, housed the rulers themselves in a walled enclosure whose outer walls rose to over 25 feet, the stones fitted together without mortar, their weight alone holding them in place. Canals threaded through the city, allowing movement by canoe, and the entire layout was designed to project an image of unassailable authority. The Sordilor kings claimed a divine right to rule, and their architecture echoed that claim in every stone. For centuries, the construction continued, expanding the complex, reinforcing the walls, adding new platforms for ceremonial structures. The site became the religious and political heart of the island, a place where tribute flowed and where the rulers maintained their control through a combination of ritual and force. Then, around the year 1628, a figure named Isoklekel arrived from the island of Kosri, according to oral tradition, leading a group of warriors who challenged the Sordilor grip. The conflict that followed shifted the entire political order of Pohnpei. The Sordilor dynasty, which had seemed so permanent, was overthrown in a series of confrontations that ended with the last king retreating to the inner sanctum of Nan Madol itself. The revolt succeeded, and the old rulers were displaced. In the aftermath, the new leadership did not continue the building program that had defined the Sordilor era. The quarries that had supplied the basalt columns fell silent, the canals were no longer dredged, the walls that had once enclosed the royal compound were left as they stood. The site was gradually abandoned as a political center, its purpose dissolved along with the dynasty that had created it. The abrupt halt of construction at Nan Madol speaks directly to the effectiveness of the revolt. The building program was not simply paused by a lack of resources or a slow decline. It was deliberately stopped because the entire system of authority that had demanded such monumental labor had been replaced. The new rulers had no need to reinforce the old capital. They established their own centers of power elsewhere on the island, leaving Nan Madol to the rising tides and the encroaching mangroves. Today, the basalt walls still rise from the water, silent and imposing. They are a monument not only to the ambition of the Sordilor dynasty, but to the sudden political change that ended their world. The stones themselves preserve the moment when one order fell and another took its place, a record of a revolt that reshaped an entire society. The stones of the Roman Forum have been walked upon by senators, emperors, and shepherds, each era leaving its own footprint in the same sacred ground. Before the empire, when Rome was still a republic governed by elected officials and a complex system of checks and balances, the earliest public buildings rose from the marshy valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills. The Temple of Saturn, dedicated around 497 before the Common Era, served not only as a place of worship but as the state treasury, where the republic's gold and silver were stored beneath the gaze of the god of agriculture. Its columns of gray stone were rebuilt multiple times, but the podium that remains today still echoes the frugal dignity of a society that valued shared authority over individual glory. Nearby, the Curia Julia, the original meeting house of the Roman Senate, was constructed in the time of Julius Caesar and later rebuilt under his adopted heir Augustus. Its simple brick exterior and open interior were designed for debate and collective decision-making, a physical expression of the Republican ideal that no single man should hold ultimate power. The building stood as the heart of a political system that had endured for nearly 5 centuries, its benches filled with patricians who believed they were shaping the destiny of a free state. Then the Republic began to crack under the weight of its own ambitions. The civil wars of the 1st century before the Common Era tore apart the old order, and when Augustus emerged as the sole ruler, the Forum began to change in ways that revealed the shift from shared power to autocratic rule. The building program that followed was not just an expansion but a deliberate redefinition of public space. The Basilica of Maxentius, begun in the early 4th century of the Common Era, was a colossal structure whose soaring vaults and vast open hall could hold thousands of people. Its 3 massive barrel vaults, supported by immense columns, created a sense of awe that dwarfed any individual. This was not a place for debate among equals. It was a stage for the emperor to appear as a living god, his authority absolute and unquestioned. The scale alone was a statement. The Republic had built for practical governance, but the empire built for spectacle and submission. Nearby, the Arch of Titus, erected after the emperor's death in 81 of the Common Era, commemorated the sack of Jerusalem in 70. Its sculpted panels show Roman soldiers carrying spoils from the temple, a celebration of military conquest and imperial dominance. The arch was a permanent trophy, a reminder that the empire was built on victory and that the emperor alone could claim that glory. The Forum that had once been a space for citizens to assemble and argue was now a museum of imperial achievement, each new addition reinforcing the message that power had shifted to a single man. The cycle of building continued for centuries, each ruler adding his own monument until the Forum became a dense forest of columns, arches, and basilicas. But the empire itself was not eternal. As the political structure of Rome weakened under internal divisions and external pressures, the Forum began to lose its purpose. By the 5th century, the administrative functions that had once filled these buildings had moved elsewhere, and the population of the city had shrunk dramatically. In the medieval period, the Forum underwent its most dramatic transformation. The grand marble pavements were stripped away for use in new churches and palaces. The columns were pulled down and carted off to be burned for lime. The Basilica of Maxentius, once a symbol of imperial ambition, became a quarry for building materials. And the entire site, the heart of the ancient world, was turned into a cow pasture. Locals called it Campo Vaccino, the field of cows. Sheep and cattle grazed among the fallen stones, their bells echoing where once the voices of orators had rung. The political upheaval that followed the fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a single event but a long unraveling, and the Forum recorded that process in the most literal way possible. A space that had been designed to project order and power became a quiet meadow, its meaning forgotten by the very people who lived in its shadow. The layers of the Forum are a physical timeline of 3 political eras: the Republic of shared authority, the Empire of absolute rule, and the medieval world that could no longer sustain either. Each phase was not just a change in building style, but a reflection of a society that had fundamentally reorganized itself. The stones that once held the treasury of the Republic now support the foundations of a church. The arch that celebrated a military victory now stands as a relic of a worldview that passed away. Walking through the Forum today, you step over the memory of 3 different Romes, each one built on the ruins of the one before. The triple land walls of Constantinople stretch across the peninsula like a scar carved into history. When the Emperor Theodosius II ordered their construction in the early 5th century, he was responding to a world that had become far more dangerous. The Roman Empire was no longer secure behind its old frontiers. Barbarian groups pressed against the Danube, and the Gothic threat had already sacked Rome itself in 410. Constantinople needed a defensive system that could withstand not just a raid but a prolonged siege. The walls that rose under Theodosius were unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. 3 lines of defense ran parallel for nearly 4 miles from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. The outer wall stood about 8 feet tall with a broad moat in front of it. 100 feet behind that rose the second wall, thicker and taller, fortified by 96 towers spaced at intervals that allowed defenders to cover every approach with archery fire. And behind that, the inner wall soared to 40 feet, its massive towers rising to 60 feet, each one a fortress in itself. The space between the walls formed a killing ground where any attacker who breached the first line would be trapped. This was not a wall, it was a machine designed to break armies. For 8 centuries that machine worked. Arab armies swept out of the desert in the 7th century and laid siege to Constantinople in 674 and again in 718. They brought siege engines and naval forces, but the Theodosian Walls held. The defenders poured Greek fire from the towers, and the attackers could never maintain a breach long enough to exploit it. After each siege, the walls were inspected and repaired. Sections that had been damaged by catapults or undermined by sappers were rebuilt, often with stronger materials. The same pattern repeated in the 9th and 10th centuries, when Bulgar and Rus forces tested the walls. Each assault revealed weaknesses, and each time the builders responded. The towers were raised higher in some sections. The outer wall was thickened where battering rams had found purchase. The moat was dredged deeper. This cycle of attack and repair became the defining rhythm of Constantinople's existence. The walls were never a static monument. They were a living structure, constantly updated to meet the latest threat. Then came the Fourth Crusade in 1204. The Crusaders did not breach the land walls. They entered through the sea walls on the Golden Horn, a section that had been neglected after years of relative peace. Once inside, they looted the city and established a Latin empire that would rule for nearly 60 years. When the Byzantines retook Constantinople in 1261, the walls were in ruin. The new emperor, Michael VIII, faced an impossible task. His treasury was empty, his army depleted, and the city was surrounded by enemies on all sides. He prioritized the walls above all else, pouring every available resource into their restoration. The towers were rebuilt, the inner wall was patched with whatever stone could be found, and the moat was cleared of debris. But the repairs were hasty and uneven. In some sections, the original marble blocks were replaced with rubble and brick. The walls that emerged were functional but weaker than their Theodosian originals. They stood, but they were a shadow of what they had been. By the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire had surrounded Constantinople on all sides. The final siege began in April of 1453, and it brought a new kind of threat that the Theodosian Walls had never faced. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II hired a Hungarian engineer named Urban to cast a massive bronze cannon that could hurl stone balls weighing over 1,000 pounds. The gun was so large that it took 60 oxen to move it into position, and it could only fire a few times a day before it needed to cool. But each shot struck the walls with a force that no ancient builder had ever anticipated. The inner wall, designed to withstand catapults and battering rams, began to crumble under the relentless pounding. The defenders had never seen anything like it. They worked through the nights, filling gaps with rubble and timber, propping up shattered towers with wooden beams. But the cannons kept firing day after day until the wall became a patchwork of fresh damage and hurried repairs. On the morning of May 29th, a final assault concentrated on a section of the inner wall near the gate of St. Romanus that had been struck repeatedly over the previous weeks. The defenders were exhausted and outnumbered. The Ottoman soldiers poured through the breach, and the city fell. Standing before the Theodosian Walls today, you can still trace the history of every major siege in the stone itself. The original Theodosian blocks of limestone and brick sit at the base, their precise courses still visible. Above them, rougher repairs from the Arab sieges show where the walls were patched and raised. The Latin occupation left scars where towers were dismantled and hastily rebuilt. And finally, the cannon damage from 1453 appears as gaping wounds in the inner wall, sections that were never repaired because the empire that built them no longer existed. The walls are a physical diary of 1,000 years of political threat, a record written not in ink but in the struggle between defense and destruction. The stones of Cusco fit together like a puzzle solved by giants. In the 15th century, the Inca emperors transformed their capital into a masterpiece of Cyclopean masonry, using blocks of diorite and andesite that weighed tens of tons each. The walls that lined the streets were not straight but curved slightly inward, a design that made them more resistant to the earthquakes that regularly shook the Andes. Each stone was carefully shaped with bronze tools and polished by hand, its surfaces faceted to interlock with its neighbors in a pattern that required no mortar. The most famous example of this engineering sits on the hill above the city, a complex known as Sacsayhuaman. Its zigzagging walls rise in 3 parallel tiers, each stone cut with such precision that a sheet of paper cannot slide between them. The largest blocks weigh over 100 tons, quarried miles away and dragged uphill by thousands of laborers working in coordinated teams. The entire structure was designed as a ceremonial stronghold, a physical statement that the Inca ruled not only the land but the very forces of nature. Their masons had learned to shape stone as though it were clay, creating a city that seemed to grow from the bedrock itself. Every doorway, every niche, every terrace followed a plan that integrated the city with the surrounding peaks and the movements of the sun. Cusco was the navel of the world, and its walls announced that centrality in every block. Then came the Spanish conquest in the 1530s, and with it a new kind of building that was not creation but imposition. When the conquistadors took control of Cusco, they did not simply occupy the Inca capital. They systematically remade it, using the very stones of the fallen empire as the foundation for their own power. The most striking example sits in the heart of the city, where the Cathedral of Cusco rises on the site of the Palace of Viracocha, one of the most important Inca royal compounds. The Spanish demolished the palace, but they left its massive stone foundations intact. They then built their cathedral directly on top of those foundations, the walls of the church rising from the same blocks that had once supported the throne of an Inca emperor. The result is a layered structure where the lower courses of Inca polygonal masonry sit beneath the ornate Baroque facade of the colonial church. The contrast is visible to anyone who walks the cobblestone streets. On the side of the cathedral, the original Inca stones remain, their dark gray surfaces worn smooth by centuries of rain. Above them, the lighter, rougher blocks of the Spanish addition tell a story of superposition, of one world placed on top of another. This was not a simple reuse of materials for convenience. It was a deliberate political statement. The Spanish were building their authority on the physical ruins of the Inca state, claiming the sacred ground as their own. The same pattern repeats across the city. The convent of Santo Domingo was built directly on top of the Coricancha, the Inca temple of the sun, which was once covered in sheets of gold. The Spanish stripped the gold, but they preserved the curved Inca wall, integrating it into the structure of their own church. The curved stone wall of the Coricancha still stands, its perfect masonry a silent reminder of the world that was buried beneath the new order. Even the street grid of modern Cusco follows the old Inca layout in many places, the Spanish having chosen to build their colonial city on the same plan rather than starting from scratch. But the overlay was not seamless. The Inca roads were narrow and designed for foot traffic. The Spanish widened some of them for carriages, breaking the original alignment. Plazas that had once been spaces for Inca ceremonies were renamed and repurposed for Spanish markets and executions. the entire city became a palimpsest, a document written over by a new hand that did not honor the text beneath. The political erasure of the Inca state was not just a matter of armies and laws. It was etched into the very architecture of the capital. Every time a Spanish priest walked into a cathedral built on Inca foundations, he was stepping on the memory of the civilization he had helped to dismantle. Walking through Cusco today, you see both layers pressed together, not as a harmonious blend but as a record of conquest. The Inca walls still stand, but they are now the base upon which a foreign power built its cathedrals and its courthouses. The stones themselves carry the weight of that history, a physical reminder that the most enduring architecture is not always the most visible, but the one that holds the past in its silent foundations. What other cities have become living archives of the worlds they replaced? The limestone blocks of Hattusa once rose in walls over 20 feet thick, a ring of stone and earth that encircled the Hittite capital for nearly 2 miles. The builders of the 14th and 13th centuries before the Common Era cut these blocks with bronze tools, fitting them together in a technique that required no mortar, their weight alone holding them in place against the tremors that shook the Anatolian plateau. Fortifications dominated every approach, the King's Gate and the Lion Gate, each carved with reliefs of roaring beasts, guarded the main entrances through the outer wall. Inside, the city unfolded in a series of temples and palaces built on terraces that climbed toward the citadel at Buyukale. The Great Temple, dedicated to the storm god Teshub, contained storerooms filled with clay tablets that recorded treaties, rituals, and political correspondence with neighboring kingdoms like Egypt. These tablets reveal a state that had built a network of alliances and dependencies, its capital a carefully planned show of power and divine favor. The Hittite kings ordered the construction of a second line of walls, a complex system of ramparts and towers that made Hattusa one of the most heavily defended cities of the Bronze Age. The labor required to quarry, transport, and stack these stones was immense, a testament to a political system that could command the resources of an entire empire. Then the world that built those walls vanished. Around 1180 before the Common Era, fire swept through Hattusa with an intensity that left its mark in every excavated layer. The roofs of the Great Temple collapsed, their wooden beams burning and turning the clay tablets inside to hardened lumps. The palace at Buyukale was gutted, its walls blackened by flame. The workshops fell silent, their tools scattered among the debris. The fire was not accidental. It spread too quickly and too thoroughly to have been a simple kitchen mishap. The evidence points to deliberate destruction, perhaps by the same groups that historians call the Sea Peoples, a loose confederation of raiders who swept across the eastern Mediterranean during this period. Or the cause may have been internal, a revolt or a civil war that tore the Hittite state apart from within. Researchers continue to debate the exact sequence, but the result is clear. The center of a great empire was abandoned almost overnight. The population fled or perished, and the once bustling capital fell into a silence that lasted for generations. When people finally returned to Hattusa, they were not Hittites. New settlers from the region of Phrygia arrived sometime in the centuries that followed, building small houses and workshops on the ruins of the old city. Their construction was a stark contrast to what had come before. Where the Hittites had used precisely cut stone blocks weighing many tons, the Phrygians built with rubble and mud brick, their walls thin and irregular. They reused some of the old stones as foundations, but they lacked the skill or the resources to shape new ones. The temples that had once risen on massive platforms were replaced by modest shrines. The great fortifications were left unrepaired, their gaps filled only with rough stone and timber. The scale of the city shrank dramatically. The Phrygian settlement occupied only a fraction of the area that Hattusa had covered at its peak. The political ambition that had driven the Hittite kings to build on such a monumental scale was simply gone. The new community was smaller, poorer, and less organized. Their buildings tell a story of a world that had fallen from a great height, its architecture reduced to the simplest forms. Walking among the ruins of Hattusa today, you see the two phases pressed together in the same stones. The massive Hittite walls still stand in places, their perfectly fitted blocks a monument to an empire that could command the labor of thousands. And in the gaps, the rough Phrygian rubble fills the spaces where the old order once held. The contrast is a physical record of political collapse, a reminder that even the most enduring fortifications are only as strong as the society that builds them. What does it mean when the next generation builds with rubble where their ancestors used stone? It means the empire that had shaped the walls could no longer shape its own future. The stone walls of Khami rise from the grasslands of Zimbabwe, a capital built by a kingdom that had already witnessed one great empire fade. After the decline of Great Zimbabwe in the 15th century, the Torwa dynasty established a new center of power about 15 miles to the west on a series of terraced hills overlooking a river valley. The builders of Khami did not simply copy the architecture of their predecessors. They created something distinct with long, low stone platforms that supported elite residences and ceremonial spaces. The walls were still dry stone, carefully fitted without mortar, but the layout was more linear and symmetrical, with a formal procession route leading up the main hill. A massive stone retaining wall, known today as the Persepolis, drops sheer for 30 feet, its surface decorated with a checkerboard pattern of lighter and darker stones. This was not just decoration, it was a statement of a ruling class that wanted to project order and permanence after the upheavals that had emptied the older capital. As the 16th century progressed, the rulers of Khami began to incorporate goods brought by Portuguese traders who had established themselves along the eastern coast of Africa. Excavations have uncovered fragments of Chinese porcelain, glass beads from Venice, and fine textiles that traveled across the Indian Ocean. These items were not simply luxuries. They were political tools. Possessing rare and exotic goods allowed the Torwa kings to reinforce their status and to reward loyal followers. The presence of these trade goods in the architectural record tells us that Khami was plugged into a global network that reached far beyond the African interior. The builders did not just import objects, they adapted their own traditions to accommodate the new wealth. Platforms were expanded, new retaining walls were added, and the stonework became more elaborate in some areas, as if the rulers were demonstrating that their kingdom could thrive even as the world around them was changing. But the prosperity of Khami was not permanent. By the late 17th century, a new political force was rising in the region. The Rozwi, a group that had once been subjects of the Torwa, began to challenge the established order. The rebellion that followed was not a single battle but a slow fragmentation of authority. One by one, the outlying settlements that had supported Khami broke away or were absorbed by the Rozwi Confederation. The capital itself did not fall in a dramatic siege. Instead, it was gradually abandoned as the political center shifted elsewhere. The workshops fell silent, the platforms that had once hosted ceremonies stood empty, and the stone walls began to weather under the sun and rain. The building phases at Khami tell this story in the most direct way possible. The earliest layers show a confident capital, carefully planned and expanded. The middle layers show the incorporation of foreign goods and the elaboration of elite spaces. And the final layers show a city that stopped growing, its last structures left unfinished or allowed to fall into disrepair. The reorientation away from Great Zimbabwe was not just geographic but political. Khami represented a new dynasty that tried to reposition itself in a changing world, only to be overtaken by internal forces it could not control. Walking among the ruins today, you see the stones of a kingdom that reached for continuity, but could not escape the currents of change that swept across the southern African plateau. Every stone in every ruin carries a story its builders never intended to tell. We walk through these ancient sites and admire the grandeur, the precision, the scale. But if you look closer at the layers of construction, the sudden shifts in style, the unfinished sections, the walls that were thickened in haste, you begin to see something else. These stones are not just monuments to glory, they are records of revolt, conquest, and collapse. The moment when a dynasty fell, the season when a siege began, the year when a ruler was captured and all building stopped. These moments are preserved not in chronicles but in the very mortar and stone. The ruins we admire are not still and silent. They are loud with the echoes of political upheaval. Every time you visit an ancient site or even look at a photograph, ask yourself, what was happening in the world when this wall was built, and what changed when the next wall was added? The building phases are a map of power shifting hands, of societies turning on themselves, of empires rising and then being erased. These 30 ruins each tell a story of how quickly the human world can be remade, and how the stones we leave behind become the truest historians of that change. Which of these ruins surprised you the most? Was it the sudden halt at Palenque, the toppling of the Moai on Rapa Nui, or perhaps the quiet repurposing of the Alhambra? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to uncover more hidden histories buried beneath the ground we walk on, subscribe and join us for the next journey into the secrets of the past.